Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Allison DuBois. I am Director of the Graduate School here at Westminster College.
Hi, my name is Dr. Molly Mistretta. I am an assistant professor and department chair of the Counseling and Development Programs at Slippery Rock University.
Today, we're going to talk to you about something that we feel really passionate about, and that is burnout and compassion fatigue.
The material that we will be covering in our presentation was taken from a book that we recently had published on the topic.
So without further ado, let's pull up our PowerPoint. Okay, today's session code is ALD09.
Imagine you saw this job opening, maybe posted in your local paper or somewhere online. Applicant wanted to embark on challenging yet rewarding career. Applicant should possess a bachelor's degree or higher, be willing to commit to long hours, and demonstrate a high degree of flexibility, as the demands of this position will change hourly and often without advanced warning. Candidates should also possess strong communication skills, as they will be expected to work effectively with colleagues, supervisors, a large and often difficult caseload, and the community at large, who often has little understanding or respect for the demands of this position. Candidates must also be willing to accept lower wages in response to other professionals with a bachelor's degree. So if this position appeals to you, please send your resumes to the people who are interviewing for your local K-12 teachers.
So what is trauma? What I'd like to emphasize is that every person experiences trauma in their own individual way. And so it could be driven from a single event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances. It typically has emotional and physical components to it that feel harmful to the person, or where they feel their life is being threatened. And ultimately, the impact of trauma is that it has lasting effects on a person's functioning in the areas of mental, physical, social, and emotional and spiritual well-being. I'm guessing that many of you in the audience have heard of adverse childhood experiences. We call them ACEs. About 15 years ago, a bunch of medical researchers out of Kaiser Permanente in California decided to start looking at different variables that could cause these long-term health problems that were sort of ongoing. So hypertension, high cholesterol, different rates of mental health disorders such as clinical anxiety or depression. And what they wanted to see is how these early childhood experiences that they had might have influenced whether they developed these chronic health conditions later in life. What was really fascinating about this study is that the participant pool, the sample was really large. There were just under 20,000 participants, and all of them were largely middle to upper middle class. They mostly had education, and so what was shocking was the rate of these ACEs amongst this particular demographic, and that it was far more pervasive than what was originally thought. And so they defined these adverse childhood experiences as abuse, which could be physical, emotional, or sexual, neglect, witnessing domestic violence as a child, growing up with alcohol or substance abuse in the home, having one or both parents with a mental illness, there being parental discord, and this would also include divorce, and if crime was present in the home.
So, the reason we feel that it's important to talk about trauma is that it does affect your own well being as a helper. Because most of us go into the education profession because we want to help students, right? We want to engage with them where they are and help them grow and develop. Those of us who are attracted to this field tend to be compassionate and tend to be empathetic. And Charles Figley is one of the key researchers in the area of compassion fatigue. And what he found through this research is that the very act of being compassionate and having empathy towards others extracts a cost from those who are the helpers. So in the ways in which we try and help others, we are often looking at their experiences through their eyes. And because they are suffering, we suffer as well. So it's important to talk about burnout because you can't really get to compassion fatigue until you've experienced burnout. And burnout's something that's pretty common in the education profession. Christina Maslach did a lot of research around the issue of burnout, and she describes it as a response to the chronic emotional strain of dealing extensively with other human beings, particularly when they're troubled or having problems. Charles Figley, who I just mentioned earlier, talks about burnout as a result of frustration, powerless, and the inability to achieve work goals. So when you think about burnout, you can think about it in terms of um, being asked to do work that exceeds the resources that you have been provided. And those resources can be individual resources that you possess in terms of your own resiliency, but they can also be limited resources in the organization in which you're working. So when you're experiencing burnout, you typically go through about 4 stages. The first one is enthusiasm, and that's when you start the job, you have high enthusiasm, high expectations. You tend to look at the field through rose tinted glasses. Everything's going to be great. In terms of the classroom, you might think, oh, my students will be reading at grade level appropriately. We won't have any behavioral problems because I'll be able to manage that. That's the high stage of enthusiasm. But oftentimes what happens is we reach a stage of stagnation. And that's when the various needs of you as an individual are not being met. And this is where we start to see a lack of resources can impact your ability to maintain your level of enthusiasm in the job. And so you're not getting enough positive reinforcement, things aren't going the way you would hope, and pressures start to build. The next stage is frustration. And this is where you begin to question the values and the effectiveness of the organization and the impact of your work. You're beginning to wonder, are we really doing what we're supposed to be doing? Are we as effective as we're supposed to be? And you begin to feel helpless and hopeless because you're beginning to see that maybe what you're doing is not making the impact that you were hoping. The last stage of burnout is a big one. It's apathy. This is where you're experiencing chronic indifference. You don't care if things are going well or not, because why bother anyway? You're beginning to think that things are destined to not go well. You might have little interest in seeing help, or beginning to question, what's the point of me doing what I'm doing? Because anything I do isn't going to change anything anyway. So, if you're already experiencing burnout and you don't address that burnout, and then you encounter trauma through maybe trauma that your students have experienced or others have experienced, the impact of what we call secondary trauma is going to push you towards compassion fatigue. Burnout is one sense of feeling overwhelmed and under supported in your work. Once you experience secondary trauma, compassion fatigue is emotional exhaustion that you can experience. And you need the presence of burnout and secondary trauma in order to continue on to compassion fatigue.
So, what are some risk factors for compassion fatigue? And it unfortunately, so we have quotes peppered throughout the presentation from other research studies that we've done, and the screen of us is covering the end of the quote, but it basically states, as a child, I endured mental and emotional abuse from my parents. I also watched domestic violence occur between my mother and stepfather. And this was from a teacher. Um, Individual risk factors. So this is where we are going to do a little bit of soul searching internally, some introspection. You are at a higher risk of developing compassion fatigue if you yourself have a personal history of trauma. If you are younger, so if you are newer to the profession, you have less professional experience, less life experience, this is considered a risk factor, because you simply have not had enough exposure to dealing with secondary trauma and handling even the ethical ramifications of it, um, to sort of steel you for handling it effectively. Lack of educational experience to trauma. So those of you that are watching our presentation right now, you are hitting this risk factor, because you are making yourself aware of what it looks like, and what some of these indicators are. The more that you know about it, the quicker you will be to identify that you're experiencing it and then mitigate what's happening internally to you. If you carry a high caseload, that is very stressful, and this could also include, teaching in districts that have a very high, um, reduced lunch, oh gosh,
Maybe a high need population.
a high need population, but I'm free reduced lunch. It took me a minute. Sorry. If you have a high free reduced lunch threshold, so kids are living in at 100 and 200% of the poverty line with limited resources. They're coming to school really hungry. They may not have winter coats or even socks. Basic needs are not being met, in addition to maybe living in a household with lots of emotional instability. If there is a lack of supervision, so you really don't have a lot of reliable, professional people that you can kind of go to when you need advice, or you need a sounding board, or you really just need somebody to help you process what you had done. And lastly, the blurring of boundaries with clients or students. And so this happens a lot with very young teachers. And an example of this, I worked with some teachers years and years and years ago, that were buying groceries for families and dropping it off, or they were going out, and with each season they were buying a set of clothes for the children and dropping those off. One year I had an entire staff buy a refrigerator for a family because the family had no capacity to refrigerate anything. They just didn't have a fridge in the house. And then, the staff got really upset. The kids came to school the following week talking about a vacation to Florida. And it turns out that the family sold the fridge to finance, the trip to Florida. And what they had learned was that, the family had lived so long without a fridge that it wasn't a value to them. They didn't value having that. But what they did value was having a vacation that they hadn't had for 6 or 7 years. But those are things that create stress for us, because we are waking up wanting to do well for others, and then feel like maybe we were taken advantage of. Some work risk factors, and this happens actually more than I wish it did, with a lot of the districts that I have worked with previously. And it is, a lot of the teachers are not clear what their role is at work, or what the expectations are for them at work. And that ambiguity amps up our stress and anxiety. If you are in, as we mentioned before, a work setting where you're dealing with a high trauma population, and so your risk of exposure is really quite high, it's daily, if the working conditions are toxic, and that includes morale, if you feel like your work environment is unstable or insecure or unsafe, or you feel unsupported, due to poor morale. Organizational and supervisory support in just about every research study Molly and I have done is probably, would you say, the key critical factor?
Especially for young professionals.
Yes, that when they do not have a strong administrator that they can go to, needing advice, needing support, and needing actually some strong guidance and mentoring, they really feel kind of like a captain without a ship. And then lastly, responses and reactions of clients and students. And so if you are unprepared for how things are being handled, if there is not something put in place to help process these difficult emotions, that can also amp up the risk factors and increase the likelihood that you'll experience compassion fatigue. So, like burnout, there is a trajectory to compassion fatigue, and there are some similarities between the two. So the zealot phase is, everybody kind of goes into teaching, keen and enthusiastic. This is when, we are bringing home 4 hours worth of work a night. And we're really not creating at that point a strong work-life balance, and separating out those two aspects of our person. Then we kind of move into the irritability phase where we're starting to cut corners. We might avoid clients, and wherever it says clients, we can insert students. This was taken from a book called Caring on Empty, which is used primarily with clinicians who we work with quite a bit too. And I've worked in K-12 education for 25 years. I often will hear mocking, and there is a difference. Humor can be such a valuable tool, and we actually talk about humor in the book, and we distinguish between the differences. So what I tend to listen to when I'm in a building is, it's one thing to sort of make a joke, but it's another when the humor is mean-spirited and it is a jab at that student or their family. You may also be making mistakes or be experiencing a lack of concentration in this phase as well. By the time you hit withdrawal, you're exhausted, you are looking at your students as, sort of a means to an end, and they bother you to some extent. And you may also be neglecting key people in your life, such as family, yourself, and at work it could be, coworkers with whom you have strong bonds, etc. The zombie phase is when you're really just kind of running on autopilot, and you are seeing an ebbing away of the compassion that you have for others. And then lastly, you can either fall into the pathology and victimization, or the renewal and maturation, meaning you are either going to feel completely overwhelmed and having thoughts that you really need to leave the profession. And this is also where you might be experiencing a change in your worldview. And I'll talk about that a little bit with an example on the next slide. Or you will be in the camp of renewal and maturation. And that's where you are transforming yourself in a positive way, and you're implementing really strong resilience. And Molly will talk about that more towards the end of the presentation. So some symptoms of compassion fatigue, and we've broken them down into these areas to help you sort of understand, with some externalizing and internalizing behaviors, what that might feel like and look like. So teachers that I've worked with in the past have reported these to, to us, I should say. And so we think that it's pretty consistent with the research that's out there. Physically, you are feeling exhausted. You may have high blood pressure or high cholesterol, that you can relate back actually to work and not family history. Um, I've had teachers report an increase in headaches, or they're now suddenly having to take Nexium, or Prilosec because of heartburn that is pervasive. I've worked with lots of teachers that actually have sleep disruptions, or especially, I like to use the example of one of the teachers that I worked with, many years ago, who he was dealing with a child who was being sexually abused. And as he would near school, some of the physical symptoms he would experience would be sweating. His heart rate would increase as he got closer and closer to the building. And he found that he was getting sicker more frequently. Emotionally, he didn't experience irritability as much as more of a withdrawal, and apathy. So he was becoming hopeless, that the situation was going to be fixed. He's married, father of two, and he was seeing things. The child was nonverbal and non-ambulatory, and she was also not potty trained. And so he and his classroom staff had to attend to her bathrooming needs. He experienced very high anxiety during the time that this was going on. He also, and a lot of my younger teachers have reported this, extreme anger, and sadness over this. In the male teacher's case, he had emotional depletion. It's like his bucket was so filled with the stress and anxiety over this, that one of the ways that he coped was going out. They lived kind of on a farm, and he would go out to the wood pile and he would cut logs. And even though physical exercise and actually being in nature, and we talk about being in nature in the book as well, those are really strong interventions. In this teacher's case, he was spending quite a bit of time, like upwards of 4 hours a night there, instead of interacting with his family. He also became very hypersensitive. And so if you entered his classroom and he wasn't expecting you, he would kind of jump up. And the paras in the room had similar responses. Spiritually, he experienced, this loss of purpose. It was affecting his faith in God. He started questioning every decision he was making and if it was an effective one. Cognitively, he had trouble with his attention and memory. He also had intrusive thoughts, and Molly will talk about that when she gets to the 4-quadrant model, that he was allowing himself to visualize what was being done to this child. Behaviorally, he was restless. One of the interesting things, though, that we have seen in some of our research actually with college age students, is that many of them who have sustained traumas minimize it, and the impact of it, and then it's manifesting itself in other destructive ways on campus. And then lastly, professionally, there is diminished work performance, low morale and motivation. There might be just an abject avoidance of tasks. There might be a lot of times where the person is calling in sick. They're just not showing up to work. Again, as a reminder, our session code is ALD09.
So we want to talk with you now that we've explained a little bit about what the trajectory and what burnout looks like, how trauma impacts individuals, and what compassion fatigue looks like. What we thought we'd do is walk you through some ways to mitigate some of these things. And so we'll be talking about coping strategies and provide you with a 4 quadrant model to sort of think about how you might want to deal with traumatic material that you encounter through your work. We're also going to talk about some self-care strategies, self-care plans. We're going to talk a little bit about how to debrief. And then we're going to also talk about how we can address compassion fatigue on a systemic level. So the 4 quadrant model, I like things that are sort of concrete, right? And so one of the things I love about the 4 quadrant model is that it gives you some concrete things to think about and steps to take for when you are going to be confronting a traumatic story or material in the course of your work. So some of the things that we talked about earlier is before you do that, you just need to take good care of yourself. So be exercising, getting good sleep. One of the things you want to think about is transitions to work. What are some routines that you can physically engage in to help separate your personal life from your work life? So for me, I've engaged in the same routine every day when I come to work. I come into work, maybe I hang up my purse or my jacket, I get settled at my desk, I go fill my teacup, and that helps me sort of move from personal to workspace. Um, so if I know that I'm going to be meeting with a student who may be telling me something traumatic, one of the things that I do while I'm meeting with that student is that I try and stay present and grounded. I'm just focused in on that student at the moment. I'm making sure that I'm using deep breaths. I've got good posture. I've got a sense for my body. How am I feeling? Am I tightening up my shoulders? I want to stay relaxed and loose. I also want to create a space. And so I try and create a physical space between myself and the student that I'm working with. And most importantly, I try and limit imagery. I'm a visual person. So oftentimes when somebody's telling me a story, I tend to visualize it in my head. When someone's sharing traumatic material with you, that's not something you want to be doing. Focus on the facts, focus on what they're telling you, but try not to create a movie image of it in your head. Right after, oftentimes when I've worked with a student who's shared something traumatic with me, what I try and do is walk with them out of the room, because what I try and do is leave that physical space where that story was shared with me. It helps me sort of leave that space, let the mood in the room clear, but also clear my head a bit. So I'll generally walk the student out of the office, and maybe I'll take 10 minutes and I might walk down the hall and go get a drink out of the drinking fountain. And then I come back to the space. So you might want to think also about breathing exercises. So after somebody's told you something traumatic, you might want to take a few minutes just for some deep breaths, again, to just sort of reorient your body to a relaxed mode. The other thing you might want to consider is, again, those transitions from and to work. I had a colleague who worked with at-risk students, and she had trouble sort of mentally separating between home and work environments. So she was driving home one day, and all she was thinking about were these students that she was working with. And she passed one of those Chick-fil-A billboards that had the cows on top. And for whatever reason, she just imagined taking all those students that filled up her headspace when she was home and mentally placing them on the billboard with the cows. I know it sounds silly, but the next morning as she was driving back from work, she mentally took those students from the billboard and put them in the back seat of her car and then drove on into work. Others, sometimes what they do at the end of the day is they clean up all the files and notes off their desk and just physically put them in a drawer. Like you're physically just putting them away for the night so you can go home with a clear head and focus on your own personal life. Again, we get to the later ongoing part of the quadrant, and that's where we're again engaging in activities, particularly after work, that help us work that stress out of our system. And so it might be exercise, it might be practicing spiritual renewal, maybe yoga, meditation, but you're trying to engage in activities that are meaningful for you and help for you to be mindful of yourself in a relaxed state. The other thing is that social connections really do matter. And we'll talk a little bit about social connections that are good and social connections that might reinforce some of the trauma and stress that you deal with. So it's important to make sure that you're connecting with others and have good positive relationships in your life, both at work and at home.
Okay, so some of the interventions that we use, we will kind of get specific with. For people that really enjoy journaling, narrative therapy techniques are very effective. And so narrative therapy was sort of born out of two researchers that are from Australia, New Zealand area. And what they the premise behind it is sort of getting out what is sort of in our head and our hearts and putting it to paper in the form of a story. But it helps us sort of externalize that material so that we can then pick it up a little later, within a couple days, and read it, and we can look at it objectively. Now, one of the interesting things about narrative techniques as well, and we actually do this as kind of a cognitive behavioral strategy, but when students are kind of feeling anxiety, for example, I will have them write everything negative or destructive that they're feeling on a note card, and then we will actually walk over to the shredder and shred it. And it's sort of like this symbolic purge, so it physically gets them to move all of that ick out and then destroy it. And they are physically watching that happen. And narrative techniques are similar. You're kind of getting it all out, and then you're looking at it from kind of an outsider perspective. And so it gives you a different perspective then, And so so one of the techniques we do is called, what's your story? And so it actually has you choose a problem that you're experiencing, and then you break it into three areas of your life. So it would be work, it would be family, and then it would be kind of community. And you write about how what the problem is, when it started, the duration of it, the different ways that it's affecting you, and then it kind of carries into, like the way that it is having an impact. Another narrative technique that we do is having students write their story in chapters. So they have to come up with, we don't really define how many chapters they need, but they have to come up with a title for each chapter, and then they have to write a chapter synopsis underneath it. And it basically is their life story. And so, some chapters are really positive and they're joyful, and then there are other chapters that are very dark. But it's kind of a way to start building self-awareness, which is how it's like an intro activity that we do with them. Because the more personally self-aware you are, the better you become at identifying things that trigger you. And so if you are working with a student that really touches upon one of your triggers, then you will be able to identify early that you might need supervision, early and often. Or that you might need to be using some of your other go-to interventions more frequently. And so narrative techniques, like I said, are really good for building more personal self-awareness. And some other strategies that are very effective are using mindfulness techniques. I actually work with a lot of our sports teams here on campus, implementing these strategies, and I've done quite a bit of research with them. And what we have found, like initially, I was working with the coaches and the teams because we wanted to actually build better, stronger, more effective athletes. But what we found as we started taking data on this is that this strategy in particular they generalized into all areas of their lives, which really shocked us, because these are like 18 to 22-year-old guys. And so, like when they're reporting that like their relationships with their girlfriends are better, their attention and focus in the classroom is much better. They are completing assignments in a timely fashion and turning them in. Their grades have improved. Better relationships with their parents. The list kind of went on and on. And so, but there are actual physiological reasons that mindfulness really does work. We don't really know from a research standpoint what the sweet spot is, so anywhere between 15 to 30 minutes daily seems to be effective. But what we do know is that after about 8 weeks of engaging in these mindfulness exercises, our brain actually does change. And we know this because we have use of functional MRIs, and it changes for the better. And so what you tend to see if you are meaningfully engaging in mindfulness exercises is an increase in your attention, focus, and self-relevance. This in turn assists with your learning and cognition, which feed into your memory. But the other benefit is it helps you regulate your emotion and impulse control. Mindfulness has the capacity to increase our empathy and compassion. And I think that the reason it does this is because it teaches you to take some deep breaths, ground yourself, be present in the moment. And it's that pause that allows you to sort of, it creates space to take in different perspectives. And when we can do that, when we're able to put ourselves in other people's shoes, we have increased our capacity for empathy. It also controls the neurotransmitters that are important for regulating emotions. It reduces the area of the brain that senses anxiety, fear, and stress. And going back to those neurotransmitters, it reduces cortisol, which is our stress hormone, and it also can reduce adrenaline and noradrenaline, which also kind of kick into gear when we're experiencing a fight or flight moment. The largest component of mindfulness actually has to do with deep breathing. So these are some ways that deep breathing actually does help us. It activates areas in the brain that are connected with antidepressive activities because it increases our serotonin, dopamine, and endorphins. And these are kind of all of the neurotransmitters that put us in a really good mood. Serotonin is like the aspirin for the brain. Dopamine is like the opioid, the natural opioid of the brain. And endorphins help us feel energized and get us ready. Slow breathing can help insomnia. And it can also create a deeper sleep. It reduces anxiety, blood pressure, and hypertension. It also enables us to take in more oxygen to the brain, which contributes to better brain function. And the ways in which that actually helps us is with decision-making and problem solving. It reboots our parasympathetic nervous system, which helps get our digestion flowing. I think that most of us can say we have been in a situation where our intestinal tract, because of nerves and or high stress, fall to pieces. Mm-hmm. And it's because of the neurotransmitters that are released at that moment. It reduces inflammation from different inflammatory conditions such as arthritis and asthma. And it can affect key processing regions of the brain that reduce chronic pain. Another intervention that we often use with professionals is a self-care plan. And what these self-care plans help us do is put in writing ways in which we are going to provide ourselves with self-care. So what interventions are going to be effective for us? It helps us become accountable to ourselves for this self-care. The other benefit to these plans from an advisory standpoint or supervisory standpoint is that, I can go to my people and say, let's get out your self-care plan. I want you to take me through what it is you're implementing right now to address this increased stress. And so you can see there are different components to it that have to deal with exercise, relaxation, things that make you happy. It's aspirational, so your hopes and dreams. If you're eating healthy, if you are keeping yourself clean, which can be an indicator of depression and clinical, generalized anxiety. And then important people that you trust. There are lots and lots of different examples of self-care plans. We actually just included one because this presentation is kind of short.
So one of the things that we often struggle with is that it's the idea that if someone experiences burnout or if somebody experiences compassion fatigue, people tend to think it's my fault. I'm just not resilient enough. I just don't have my act together enough. And what that does is it gives the systems a pass. And the truth is that burnout and compassion fatigue have just as much to do with the system and organization in which you are working than the individual. And it's not going to improve unless we address the organization and systemic issues. And so basic things, you're definitely set up for burnout and compassion fatigue if you don't receive an adequate salary or have appropriate amount of time off. And so one of the things that organizations need to look at is that what are our expectations for our employees, and do they exceed what is realistic? Oftentimes, organizations overlook the importance of orientation. This is a busy world, and oftentimes we bring in new people and expect them to hit the ground running, and that's just not sufficient to help somebody transition into an organization and help them develop the skills that they're going to need to succeed in that orientation. So there needs to be an orientation process, an onboarding process. There needs to be ongoing professional training, and there also needs to be appropriate supervision so people feel like they can do their jobs and that they have the resources and support to do their jobs well. And that organizations also need to provide access to medical and mental health support services. So if someone needs support beyond what the organization can provide, that there are resources for them to pursue those avenues. The organization needs to consider its culture. What are things going on in the organization? And these are easy for supervisors to implement. How are people making connections? How are they forging good workplace connections? What is the morale? What can we do to help boost morale? And oftentimes we think these are things that we need to have lots of money and budgets for. Actually, there are a lot of great ways to address connections and morale that don't really cost a whole lot, but doing things in a way that allow people to create and maintain positive work relationships can go a long way. And then also having a good system of feedback. For people to have good morale, they need to feel like their concerns are heard and that those concerns will be responded to in some way. So supervisors, if you're a supervisor, that's great. You're here because the first step is understanding what are the conditions that create burnout and compassion fatigue. So understanding the psychological and spiritual impact of the work that's being done in your organization. Also being present and making sure that during times of increased pressure or crises, that you're there to help the staff keep the current challenges in perspective. Expressing concern and implementing things that promote the general well-being of staff. I talked a little bit about suggestions and feedback and making sure those are heard. And then also making sure that staff who are struggling with burnout and compassion fatigue are not stigmatized for either addressing it or seeking help. And then the last thing is keeping a positive environment and promoting a culture where people are praised and acknowledged for doing good work. So I get that burnout and compassion fatigue can sometimes be a downer of a subject, but we want to reinforce too that there's a thing called compassion satisfaction, and that is the pleasure we get or derive from being able to do our work well. Sometimes the thing about struggle is that we often grow throughout that struggle. And so it's been nice when you have staff who can look back and say, wow, because of that experience, I'm a better teacher, I'm a better educator, I'm a better school counselor, and I know I can do my work well under challenging situations.
So these are 12 simple things that you can do on a daily basis, really. Not all 12 at once, but these are things that we highly recommend because they are little effort for big impact.
Right.
Do someone a 5-minute favor because social connections matter. Hide your phone and all technology for that matter for 15, 20 minutes a day. I don't know, usually when we do big trainings and workshops, we'll have everybody raise their hand who is guilty of watching Netflix while looking at their phones, social media feeds. So and then they may have their laptop open too. So, having multiple means of technology open at once, and we're multitasking. Take a break from all of it. Many of us, and a lot of my colleagues in K-12 work through lunch. And it's really important to take a break at lunch. And with that being said, the next one is get moving. Some of the schools that I've worked with actually created different walk groups that at lunchtime for 30 minutes, they would walk. And so they would kind of figure out a path when the weather was inclement, and in Western Pennsylvania, it's a lot of the year. But they would figure out a path through the schools so that they would get 25 minutes of walking in, and then it actually ticked off 2 boxes: the social connections and the exercising. Because exercising also gets more oxygen into our bodies, which improves brain function. It also decreases a lot of the neurotransmitters that create stress for us too. Getting back to nature. There's a lot of studies that are coming out now, and we have seen them really more in the past 2 years, that talk about the difference that being outside makes versus working out in a sterile gym setting, for example. And so, breathing in fresh air, unless you're super allergic to pollen, and then it could be rough for you. But joke. But getting outside, seeing the leaves, seeing a pretty lake, and maybe taking your dog along with you. Reflecting on little things. Those of you that work in special education, which I spent many years of my career prior to higher ed in, you would almost measure progress in baby steps. And so you really had to kind of embrace daily those really small victories, because that's what got you through it and got you ready for the next day. And so reflecting on little things that are meaningful to you. Again, disappearing for 15 minutes and not being available. For those of you with young children, we feel your pain and understand what that is like too, especially during the COVID crisis.
Disappearing got a little more tricky.
Yes. And we wouldn't judge you if you were sitting cross-legged in the dark in your closet. Nurture your artsy side. So we've done some trainings where we actually have brought adult coloring books, and kind of given them out as door prizes to people. And so, because I'm not that artistic, but, doing something like that. I know even for Mother's Day this year, my kids got me this really nice watercolor kit. And so we will see how that goes. Play with a pet. create a comfort kit. So this could be, if you are really driven by scents, for example, this could be just different things of that particular fragrance that you really like that will calm you down, because usually the smells connect us to fond memories. For me personally, I actually keep a folder of all of the thank you letters or notes that students and parents have written me. And when I'm having a particularly awful day, I'll kind of pull that out and read it to sort of reassure myself that, whatever is going on is temporary. Pamper yourself. This could be a manicure, pedicure, facial, anything like that. And lastly, just showing gratitude to others. So, maybe waking up every day and thinking about 3 things that you're grateful for, and then maybe writing down 3 things that would make today great. These are some additional resources that you can get more information on in regards to this topic. And if you have any questions, you can find us on our website. Molly is a professor at Slippery Rock, and I am at Westminster College. And we can be found there.
Absolutely.
The organizers also of the this ed camp also have our contact information. So please feel free to reach out to us. We actually talk to teachers directly, all the time, after they either sit in on one of our sessions or they see our book and are interested in learning more about it and have some questions. So please feel free. Is there anything else you'd like to say?
No. We appreciate you taking the time to meet with us today.
We wish you well. We hope that you have an excellent rest of your summer. And we also hope that you have an uneventful beginning of the 2020 school year.